I'd like to look at two world religious traditions from the East. The so-called, at least according to Peter Berger, the so-called religions of interiority. These both come from China. And the first is Daoism. You might also see that spelled with a T. It's spelled both ways, but more regularly it's spelled with a D. So Daoism is a fascinating religion. It comes from a somewhat mythical, perhaps, character whose name is Lao Tzu. So it's around the 6th century, 500s, before the Common Era. And I find myself really taken with Taoism in terms of its flowing kind of philosophy. If you were to say Taoism is like jazz, there's improvisation. We're going to see a little bit later that the contrast would be clear with Confucianism, which is more like classical music. In other words, there's improvisation in jazz and classical music. It's set. You play what's on the musical score. Let me read how Prothero begins his chapter on Taoism, chapter 8 of his book, God is Not One. Modern life is purpose-driven. Though much of it is conducted in an office chair, it is nonetheless about speed and efficiency. Galloping by sitting. Wandering by contrast is slow, unproductive, and open to surprises. If you have a destination or even a plan, you aren't on a wander. Purposeless by design, wandering is closer to play than to work. It lets circumstance and desire take you where they will, and it doesn't sweat the outcome. And so Prothero goes on and contrasts this kind of wandering with the more purpose-driven Western monotheisms that we are studying. And he says this: whereas Christians and Muslims tend to view this world as a dress rehearsal for the world to come, this is the Taoist mantra. Socially, Taoism represents a revolt of the land against the city, of China's rural south against its urban north. We are at home on earth and in our bodies. We are least ourselves when those bodies are stuck in the concrete of a city sidewalk. We are most ourselves when walking through the mountains. Though it should be surprising that Taoist scriptures portray wandering. So it should not be surprising that Taoist scriptures portray wandering as freedom. To be lost in the maze of social convention and ritual propriety, as in Confucianism, led around by the noose of norms and the normal, is to be alienated from yourself, from other people, and from the environment. To lose yourself in mountains or valleys is to return to the origin of things, including your own nature. To roam in the company with the Tao, led only by intuition and desire and the innate curiosity of the child, is to discover who you really are, your natural spontaneity, vitality, and freedom. And so we come to Lao Tzu, who is said to be a record keeper in an imperial court in the 500s, before the Common Era, the 6th century BCE. Had some famous sayings. I always love his idea of Wu Wei, which we'll get to a bit below, but it is summarized in this: when nothing is done, nothing is left undone. And then, in great contrast with the Christian and Jewish scripture of Genesis, which tells the followers that they are given the ability to have dominion over the earth, which really is for all human beings, so thus it's said to be for all of us, to take the earth and to shape it. Here in Taoism, we read, those who would take over the earth and shape it to their will never, I notice, succeed. And so these collections of sayings by a person referred to as Lao Tzu are called the Tao Te Ching, the way and its power. So I have there's videos in the further version that you'll see in the PowerPoint slides. So as I said, we're looking at Taoism, pronounced as it is Taoism, alleged to be founded by the founder Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu. Another way to pronounce it His key book is the Tao Te Ching. Both Taoism and Confucianism emerged in the 6th century before the Common Era, which is this period of the axial age that Karl Jaspers talked about that I mentioned last time. And in Taoism, the key concept is the Tao. You can see it's spelled a T or a D, and again, I'll probably encourage you to lean more toward the D, as my scholars in Chinese religion say that's more accurate. Anyway, every being in the universe is an expression of the Tao. And if you contrast it again with Confucianism, which will be an easy contrast for this particular online, or I should say video lecture, while the stuffy Junzi, the profound person, served as the Confucian model, the spontaneous sage, the genuine person, Zhenren, functions as an exemplar in the Daoist tradition. So it's this spontaneous person. Now, sometimes it gets asked, how many Daoists are there? And I've done a little work on this, and I can't say that I've come up with what I would call a definitive answer, but I did get this particular overview. Quote, the number of Daoists is difficult to estimate due to the variety of factors defining Taoism. According to a survey of religion in China in the year 2010, the number of people practicing some form of Chinese folk religion is near to 970 million, or 70% of the Chinese at the time. Among those, 13%, or 173 million, practice some sort of Taoist-defined folk faith, and then 12 million have some formal initiation into Taoism and adhere exclusively to it. So that last part we're going to get to whether there's a need to be exclusively tied to a religion in China, and the answer is no, not really. You can be a Taoist, a Buddhist, a Confucian, all at once. Another form of three is there are three forms of Taoism. There's philosophical, religious, and popular. And so if you read about Taoism other places or hear about it, you might see some of those. We're going to look more at the philosophical side because it has most of the worldwide impact, and yet it does have religious components. So in Taoism, the Tao, you can spell the T or a D, has three main meanings: ultimate reality, nature or the universe, and the human path. So, those first meanings get us close to something like the laws of physics or the space-time continuum. And then the human path gets us closer to a kind of a moral law in that sense. But these are connected. The way the universe is, if we fall and abide in it, will create the right moral path for us. One of the key images of Taoism is water that flows easily with the way the universe is structured, or like the banks of a river are structured, or whatever. So here's something from the Tao Te Ching. There is a being, wonderful, perfect. It existed before heaven and earth. How quiet it is, how spiritual it is. It stands alone and it does not change. It moves around and around, but does not on this account suffer. All life comes from it. It wraps everything with its love as in a garment, and yet it claims no honor, for it does not demand to be Lord. I do not know its name, and so I call it Tao, the way, and I rejoice in its power. So that's the first thing, is this idea of the Tao. The second in Taoism is the idea of Yin-Yang. So Yang we tend to think of as the sun, and yin as the moon. Yang, as you can see, light, activity, expanding, heaven, loud, hot or above. Yin, as I mentioned, moon, darkness, rest, contracting, earth, quiet, cold, and below. And that great yin-yang symbol, which you see great in terms of its expanse, you see throughout, throughout our culture, but also on, for example, the Korean flag and so on. It's the idea of this balance and harmony, which is such a part of Chinese thought and philosophy traditionally. A man named Se Weng owned a beautiful mare which was praised far and wide. One day this beautiful horse disappeared. The people of his village offered sympathy to Se Weng for his great misfortune. Se Weng said simply, "That's the way it is." that there's always this balance of loss and possession, happiness and sadness, and neither is good or better, I should say. They work together. Neither is to be preferred. They're just a part of the balance of the universe. That's the yin-yang. We'll get back to this idea. Number 3 of our topics is Wu Wei, creative quietude, pure effectiveness, effortless action, creative letting be. Wu may be translated as not, have, or without. Wei may be translated as do, act, serve, govern, effort. So literally, Wu Wei means without action, without effort, without control. Here are some wonderful sayings from the Tao Te Ching that exemplify the Wu Wei. One may move so well that a footprint never shows, speak so well that the tongue never slips, reckon so well that no counter is needed. Or something that sounds a lot like sayings that I've heard in English, in terms of American English sayings. Muddy water let stand will clear. So this idea of being in the flow, that being in the groove. I've a drummer, and when you play music really well and rhythmically, there's this sense of actually there's really good moments where you enter into something bigger than yourself and you feel a groove around you that you're actually a part of, and you actually don't have to have effort. It just flows with you. That's, I think, a sense of the Wu Wei. The Wu Wei is also related to this idea of qi, which is part of the Daoist practice, part of the life energy, vital breath or energy. Maybe you've seen Tai Chi or practiced Tai Chi, but it's this practice of the movement of the body to let the qi flow meaningfully and effortlessly through your body. So there's this idea in philosophical Taoism to have life's normal allotment of qi deployed for the best effect. And so it's this life force that goes through all things. And in the Daoist cosmology, to take that a little farther, as I mentioned, there's not a direction like in Western religions, not a sense of life begins, move through our earthly life, and then moves into, you might say, the eschatological or heavenly life in Judaism, Christianity, Islam. But there's a sense of a directionless life. It just keeps going in circles. It's cyclical. If you know the ending of the Matrix series, the films, what Neo affects at the end is not the triumph of good over evil, but a balance, a harmony to the universe. That's much more Taoist than, say, in the Lord of the Rings, where the destruction of the ring creates a suppression of evil, not an elimination entirely, but a suppression of evil. So that would be more of a Western religious view. So it tends to be pantheistic, that God is part of everything. The God of the Tao is in everything. I mean, these are terms that may or may not align with any particular Taoist or any school, but that are, way of understanding it, in terms of theology, you might say, the view of God or the divine. This contrasts with Hinduism. So being with the Tao is not necessarily a union with a eternal spirit, like you would see in this union of Brahman and Atman that I talked about in the previous class. So just for a second, think about these sayings. Every being in the universe is an expression of the Tao. That is why love of the Tao is the very nature of things. Practice not doing, and everything will fall into place. If you want to accord with the Tao, just do your job and then let go. So then we come to this idea of the Chinese religious complex. And look at this painting. And this question, another question for you, is, can you belong to more than one religion at a time? We're going to get to this in the final section in unit of the class, but it seems to me that part of what's happening in the religious life, especially in 20 people between 18 and 30 is a sense of blending various spiritual or religious inputs. I have in my hand a book by Dwayne Bidwell called When One Religion Isn't Enough, where he argues that it's very natural for people, in his view, to be both Buddhist and Christian among other options of bringing at least two religions together. Well, in the Chinese tradition, the three laughing men by the Tiger Stream from the 12th century has Confucian, Daoism, and Buddhism all together. Some say there's a saying in China that the Chinese go to Taoism for healing, Buddhism for funerals, and Confucianism for norms of daily life. So see what you think of that when we look at this, the Confucianist approach. We're a little more sure of Confucius, the Chinese teacher, editor, politician, and philosopher. And he lived probably around 550 to 480, 551 BCE to 470 BCE. Probably a little younger than Lao Tzu, if Lao Tzu did indeed live. Listen again to Prothero. This is from his third chapter. This is on Confucianism, the way of propriety. Over the long haul of human history, Confucianism may have carried more clout than any other religion. Confucius is almost certainly one of the 5 most influential people in recorded history. And although Daoist classics are far more popular in the West, the Analects, the authoritative collection of Confucius's words and deeds, that is the Confucian equivalent of Islam's Hadith, is among the world's most influential books. In fact, it has yielded more power over more people over more time than any other scripture, with the possible exception of the Bible. Before Socrates, Confucius told us that real knowledge is knowing the extent of your ignorance. Before Jesus, he gave his own version of the golden rule, quote, do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire, end of quote. Before Wall Street crashed, he said, the gentleman understands what is moral, the small man understands what is profitable, end of quote. Before we fell in love with the romantic comedies of Hollywood and Bollywood, he said, quote, whatsoever you can, go with all your heart, end of quote. And before President Bill Clinton was impeached, Confucius asked, quote, if you fail to be conscientious and trustworthy in word, then you can be sure of going forward without obstruction, even in your own. Then can you be sure of going forward without obstruction, even in your own neighborhood? Further on, he says, Confucianism is grouped today alongside Taoism and Buddhism as China's 3 teachings. Unlike in the West, where the jealous monotheisms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam dictate that people choose one and only one religion, in China the 3 teachings mix and mingle quite amiably. According to another popular Chinese saying, another to the one I said earlier, quote, every Chinese wears a Confucian cap, a Taoist robe, and Buddhist sandals, end of quote. Or another one is, Chinese are Confucians at work, Taoists at leisure, and Buddhists at death. So there you have it. Let's go on just to further great sayings you may have heard. Confucius says, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. By these 3 methods, we may learn reflection. We may learn wisdom. First, by reflection, which is noblest. Second, by imitation, which is easiest. And third, by experience, which is bitterest. My 10th grade, I think it was 10th grade, or maybe 9th grade, geometry teacher had that first saying up, Art Bocher. I'll never forget it. He encouraged us to do the math to learn it best of all. So remember that China represents about 20% of the world's population and the second largest and fastest growing economy in the world. Confucianism is China's, quote, chief mentor, end of quote, according to Novak. So art in China, if you look at this piece to the left, you see the small figures. If you see them down toward the bottom third, you can barely see them perhaps, but if you look closely, Nothing in the world is softer or weaker than water, yet nothing is better at overcoming the hard and the strong. This is because nothing can replace it, that the weak overcomes the strong and the soft overcomes the hard. Everybody in the world knows, but cannot put into practice. From the Tao Te Ching. So we learn that, especially in Chinese art, reflected that humanity is just a part of the entire cosmos, and secondly, that water is seen as the great image of triumph, of how to live. So Confucius, or Confucius, lived about 550 to about 480. He's not a prophet in the West. He's not a yogi, as in India, but an educator. He lived in a period of the decline of the Zhou dynasty, which had been in existence, was in existence for 800 years, but was in hundreds of years of decline. It wouldn't quite end until about 220. But still, he lived in a period of social instability and change, but yet creativity. He was born to a family of poverty. His father died when Confucius was 3. He failed to convince the government to adopt his ideas. So for all of us that have had great ideas and they haven't landed, maybe Confucius is a patron saint, you might say. It was during the Han Dynasty of 200 before the Common Era, 206 before the Common Era to 220 of the Common Era, that Confucianism became the official Chinese religion. And when you think about Confucianism as Chinese, it might be interesting to reflect on the way that China versus the United States worked with the COVID-19 outbreak. China was much more societally based, and we'll see why that is in just a minute, whereas we focus much more on states' rights and individualism, even as we had to work with implementing some national kinds of approaches. So, as I pointed out earlier, Confucius' sayings were collected in the Analects, written down in the period approximately 70 years after his death. The second book in the Confucian canon, the Mentsu, is named after its author, Mencius, who lived from 371 to 289 before the Common Era. All right, 4 major Confucian themes. The first is that we are self in relation. So I'm going to go back and say, before I get to these themes, there's a kind of 5 virtues. So I'm getting a bunch of numbers here, but we'll start with these 5 virtues. Ren, benevolence or humanness. Li, proper right. Yi, righteousness or justice. Ji, knowledge. And Jin, integrity. I do not speak Chinese. That's the best I can do, given my when I've discussed this with with scholars who do know Chinese. So back to the first thing of 1, self in relation. The fundamental unit is not the individual nor the group, but the two in ceremonial harmony. But especially important is the group, because when you think about living in this way, the way to understand it is that we cannot exist as an individual unless the group works together. We never act alone. We are our relationships, and there are 5 particular ones: parent-child, husband-wife, elder sibling, younger sibling, friend, and ruler subjects. So it's our decisions are about proper behavior, right? Not only about proper and right actions, but the nature of identity is also within this relationship, and we learn our identity by properly acting. So, as Confucius said, quote, "The life of the moral person is an exemplification of the universal moral order, or the mean." That's the kind of balance idea. And the life of the vulgar person is a contradiction of the moral order. And again, you can see it here that self is embedded in family, is embedded in society, is embedded in the whole cosmos. So empathy and regard for others extends progressively outward from the self. So here's an example of filial piety, how husband and wife should treat parents. And it's important to think about why this would be something that would be emphasized, because when you don't have Social Security, you don't have a place to go in your society when you're older. Here you have your children to take care of you. That is the Social Security net. And so how a husband and wife should treat their parents, should treat parents as extremely important. On getting to where they are, with bated breath and gentle voice, they should ask if the parents' clothes are too warm or too cold, whether they are ill or pained or uncomfortable in any part, and if they be so, they should proceed reverently to stroke and scratch that place. They should, in the same way, going before or following after their parents in quitting or entering the apartment and bringing in the basin for them to wash, the younger will carry the stand and the elder the water. They will beg to be allowed to pour out the water, and when the washing is concluded, they will hand the towel. They will ask whether they want anything, and then respectfully bring it. All this they will do with the pleasure of making their parents feel at ease. So this is number one, self and relation. Number two is this idea of ren or zhen, goodness, benevolence, or humanness. I'll just read you a couple of the sayings. Is humanness a thing remote? I wish to be human, and behold, humanness is at hand. Humaneness is at hand. It is not. Humaneness is not a thing remote. The master said, "Is not reciprocity such a word? What you do not want done to others, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others." This is now Confucius's form of what we call the golden rule. It's called the silver rule because it's in the negative, a double negative. Don't do unto others as you would not want them to do unto you. And then the idea of li, or rights. The master said this in the Analects, quote, "Respectfulness without the rules of propriety becomes laborious bustle. Carefulness without the rules of propriety becomes timidity. Boldness without the rules of propriety becomes insubordination. Straightforwardness without the rules of propriety becomes rudeness." So the doctrine of the mean, this is back to the idea of the middle, or the Yin-Yang, is that there's moderation in everything, and that's where the propriety comes from. So here's a little picture for you. Where is this propriety, this li? Where is it on a Halloween night in Chico? Where is it in the 1950s dancing? And when students and parents agree about what is propriety. Finally is the Junzi, the exemplary person, the gentleman, the noble leader, who's not, by the way, the Tseng or the sage, but is a person who cultivates humanness and propriety, ren and li. Exemplar, the Junzi is an exemplar whose virtuous life promotes a flourishing human community. Not a ruler over inferior subjects, but rather a moral character who leads by conduct and character. So I find that fascinating. Maybe you've met those people in life who, just because of who they are and the way they've embodied their values, just lead out of those things. This is contrasted with Joren, the smaller, petty person who does not grasp the value of these virtues and seeks only immediate gain. So those four qualities, those four characteristics of Confucianism, you see this contrast between Confucianism, which emphasizes the classical music, what has been written, and the order, whereas the spontaneity is more a part of Daoism. And maybe you want to ask yourself, which side do you lean more toward? Being somebody who puts life together and organizes it and believes in some kind of stability, or you who those of us who like to be spontaneous? Which one do we lean toward? So is Confucianism a religion? Prothero works with this, as does also Huston Smith, who I've mentioned, and Prothero calls it religious humanism. And even if religion is taken in a narrow sense of, quote, a concern to align humanity with the transcendental ground of its existence, and of, quote, according to Huston Smith's definition, Confucianism appears to be a religion. And it's important in connecting heaven and earth and this idea of self and relationship. Now, heaven is not the same as God, but heaven, as described by Prothero, is, quote, an impersonal force that watches over human life and legitimates the authority of its rulers. Nonetheless, there are deities you can see in Chinese thought, and you can see this deity, Ji Wan Mu, who lives in the Kunlun Mountains in the far west at the margins between heaven and earth. So I've tried to give a sense of Eastern religions, both in what I presented earlier, and then in this lecture on these two Chinese religions, Confucianism and Daoism. And Eastern religions have a way of blending different inputs, whereas the Western monotheistic tradition tends to be much more focused on being aligned with just one religion. So here's a final quote now back to a leader from Hinduism, Ramakrishna, who lived in the 1800s. Ramakrishna said this: God has made different religions to suit different aspirations, times, and countries. All doctrines are only so many paths, but a path is by no means God himself.